Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Graduate Center. I'm delighted to see you all. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm Provost of the Graduate Center, and my function is to do two things, so far as I can tell. First, to introduce those of you who are new to the Graduate Center, to say a word or two about us, and then I'll introduce you all to the introducer, who will introduce the program. The Graduate Center is a small part of the very large organization entity that is the City University of New York. 23 campuses, 285,000 full-time students spread across the 5 boroughs. The Graduate Center is devoted almost entirely to PhD education. We have about 4,800 students, and of those, 4,600 are pursuing PhDs. We also have, in addition to our 32 or 33 PhD programs, 30 research centers. Music is one thing about which we are proud, something that we try to do as well as we possibly can. We have a very active music program, a very active center, as you will be hearing in a moment. It's a great pleasure to see all of you coming. I'm told that there's a simulcast taking place downstairs, precisely because we are so overbooked. Enough of the Graduate Center then. I'm sure you're very, very keen to see the event begin. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Barbara Dobbs McKenzie, who's the director of the Barry S. Brook Center for Music Research and Documentation, who is the prime mover for this program and indeed much else that goes on in the Graduate Center in the way of music. So Barbara, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Chase, and good evening, everyone. And I want to join Chase in welcoming you all to this event tonight. As he mentioned, I'm Barbara Dobbs McKenzie, and I'm director of the Barry S. Brook Center for Music Research and Documentation. And this is our inaugural lecture for a new series at the Brook Center, 21st-Century Music and Society. Before I forget to say this, don't forget to turn off your cell phones, because we will have some piano and various other things we don't want to have interrupted. First, let me briefly introduce our center to you. The Brook Center is a scholarly facility closely associated with the doctoral programs in music here at the Graduate Center. Its objectives are to promote and provide a setting for wide-ranging research and documentation activities in music, and to disseminate the results of its activities to the scholarly community and the world at large through publications, conferences, exhibitions, and lectures. Now, I'm about to transgress the rules of good public speaking. And not only that, I'm going to violate 2 rules simultaneously. I'm going to list for you the Brook Center's current projects. And you know, speaking a list is deadly to listen to. I'm going to do it anyway. Not only that, I'm also going to read it too quickly. So please forgive me for that. My goal in doing this is to give you just a rough overview of what happens at the Brook Center. So here goes. Our projects include the following: RILM, which is the premier index to writings about music from around the world, the Research Center for Music Iconography, the Foundation for Iberian Music, Music in Gotham, which is chronicling musical life in New York City in the second half of the 19th century, the Center for the Study of Free Reed Instruments, the Xenakis Project of the Americas, the Seminars of the Ensemble for the Romantic Century, I'm almost done, the French and Francophone Musical Culture Project, and as of this evening, our new lecture series entitled 21st Century Music and Society, the Lloyd Old and Constance Old Lectures. The series aims to present talks and debates by major cultural figures addressing the changing consumption, creation, contexts, and valuations of music in today's society. The series is inspired and supported by Constance Old and her brother, the late Dr. Lloyd Old. For years, the Lloyds shared a passion and curiosity about the role of music in contemporary society, and this series is an outgrowth of that interest. Sadly, Dr. Old died in late November, a few months before tonight's inauguration of the series, to which he was so devoted. And while he is sorely missed, Not only is Constance Old here, but she has worked hard behind the scenes to support and to make this series a reality. And I'd like to acknowledge her now. Constance Old, please stand. Now on to the main event. Let me outline for you the way the evening will proceed. After I introduce tonight's speakers, Charles Rosen will present his talk, Challenges of Modernist Music. After that, Dan Wakin will join him on the stage for a conversation, following which Mr. Wakin will moderate questions from the audience. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening, and I'm going to do it in reverse order of when they will appear on the stage. Dan Wakin is a reporter in the culture department of the New York Times. He covers classical music and dance, a broadly defined terrain that includes orchestra finances, the lives of musicians, conductors, music education on the West Bank and in Brooklyn, the behind-the-scenes plots in opera houses, retiring ballerinas, newly emerging choreographers, and obscure instruments such as the theremin. Mr. Wakin has taken beginning ballet classes and written about it, traveled with the New York Philharmonic to North Korea, chronicled a Juilliard class 10 years after graduation, sat with a percussionist as he played in The Producers on Broadway, dissected the bitter breakup of a string quartet, and wrote a 3-part series about the rise of China in the world of classical music. Mr. Wakin has done a number of public interviews with the likes of Mark Morris, James Levine, and others at Times Talks, a series in the Times Auditorium. He occasionally appears in New York Times Close-Up, a program on New York One, and WQXR's Soundcheck. We are delighted to have Dan Wakin with us this evening. Charles Rosen has been described as the single most influential writer on music of the past half-century. Yet he began his writing career almost as an afterthought. In 1951, the year he turned 24, Rosen earned his PhD in French literature from Princeton, made his New York performing debut, and recorded his first album. The native New Yorker quickly became one of America's most renowned classical pianists, playing in recitals and as a soloist in orchestra concerts around the world. His career blossomed so rapidly that already by 1955, Rosen was able to leave his academic position teaching French at MIT after only 2 years, though he has held many distinguished temporary academic positions since, including at Harvard, Oxford, and Chicago universities, where he held a prestigious professorship on the Committee on Social Thought. Rosen's performances impressed some of the 20th century's most prominent modernist composers, including Igor Stravinsky, Pierre Boulez, and Elliott Carter, all of whom asked Rosen to play their music. He's especially acclaimed for his recordings of Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, and Schoenberg, and for the first complete recordings of Debussy's Etudes. He was honored as the 2008 Instrumentalist of the Year by Musical America. Rosen's career as one of the country's preeminent classical performers triggered his parallel vocation as a writer about music. He shunned the subject while in college, where he majored in French literature. Unimpressed by the liner notes for one of his 1960 recordings, Rosen decided henceforth to write his own. Those notes caught the eye of a publisher who invited Rosen to write books. Thus began a long and distinguished career of writing about music, especially in the New York Review of Books, where he aims for writing that is intelligible to general readers as well as to academics. This has resulted in a broad readership comprised of music scholars, of course, but also of musicians, non-musicians, and experts in other fields. In fact, a perfect case in point is the Olds. Dr. Lloyd Old was a renowned cancer researcher and a musician in his own right. Constance Old is a landscape designer and horticulturalist who's had a lifelong interest in the performing and visual arts and their relationship to culture. Both have been avid readers of Rosen's articles in the New York Review of Books. So it's particularly fitting that Charles Rosen is inaugurating the series inspired and supported by the Olds. Rosen's books number more than a dozen, with a brand new book entitled Freedom and the Arts, just published by Harvard University Press, and which you can peruse in the lobby. There's a stack on the table out there. Rosen's inclination to write extensively about music history grew out of his love of art history. I was always interested in literature and art, he has recalled. I used to go to museums when I was a child. If art historians could write great books on Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, he reasoned, then I certainly could write about Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And indeed, Rosen's writings about these composers culminated in one of the century's most important books on music, the 1972 National Book Award winner, The Classical Style. Other important works followed, from the Romantic generation to his recent Music and Sentiment. He's also written about literature, food, and art history. Rosen's style is erudite, but decidedly non-academic, and sometimes, like his conversation, sprinkled with wry, occasionally self-deprecating wit. Not surprisingly, his performances have been praised for elucidating the musical structures of the great compositions. They're informed by both his extensive historical study and knowledge of how a work has been interpreted since it was composed. This evening, we are privileged to hear both sides of Mr. Rosen's prodigious talents as he speaks to us about the challenges of modernist music and demonstrates for us at the piano. And now, because I know you all want me to stop talking and him to start talking, and I feel the same way, it gives me a tremendous amount of pleasure to introduce you to Charles Rosen. Thank you.
Oof. Is that I've been asked to talk on the subject of modernism. I'm a little afraid that I may have written myself out on that subject. So I'll try to make it a bit different. I start with some autobiography. I don't remember this story exactly, but when I was 7, I heard Debussy for the first time. I'd been brought up on Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner, but the first concert I ever heard was Arturo Toscanini conducting the New York Philharmonic, still at that time, as his last season, of the Beethoven 8th and 9th Symphony, and I always thought that's what all music should sound like from then on. When I heard Debussy, I'm told, when I was 7, I said, there should be a law against music like that. And I must have come around to Debussy after a while, because I certainly played some when I was 10 or 11 by that time. Is that I used to say, I'm not really boasting about being any kind of prodigy. All pianists start very young. All my friends who are pianists all start when they were 3 or 4 years old. It's like tightrope walking. If you don't start, then you fall off. And I'm not joking. Is that all pianists begin when they're about 4 years old. So I did come around to Debussy, but I remember when I was 17, I heard Bartók for the first time, Fifth Quartet. And it made me actually feel slightly seasick. I've certainly experienced nausea. I certainly came around to Bartók. And then I was at Princeton, and that was a big center because Roger Sessions had taught there. Unfortunately, rather a bad composer was there at the time. It was there Randall Thompson, but I never got on with him. But Bohuslav Martinu came, and that was much better. And in any case, Milton Babbitt was teaching there, and I became friends with him and heard some of the music. But I never actually had played any Milton Babbitt until I was 24. And I think to understand some aspects of modernism, I should recount what happened. Yes, there was concerts of pupils of Roger Session. Milton was actually one, and several others. was a clarinetist called Smith, I remember. A pianist was Bobby Helps, who regularly had some kind of breakdown. And they called me up and asked me if I would like to be a possible substitute for a pianist, which I didn't think was a very nice invitation. And finally, Bobby did actually have a breakdown, and they said, can you do these concerts with us in 1 week? That there's this concert there are clarinet pieces with piano, and there was some songs, and there were 3 pieces of Milton Babbitt. They said, you can't possibly learn 3 pieces of Milton Babbitt in a week. I said, we'll get the music sent to me. And I did have rather a strange experience. The music arrived, you could get very fast mail back in those days. And I started practicing the first piece, which is quite short, lasts about 2.5 to 3 minutes. And I practiced it for 4 hours or more. Then the next day I got up and tried the piece, and it was as if I had never seen it. And I really got frightened. So I practiced about that funny. It started, the third day it came. And the other pieces came quite fast. There is this problem I have here to help explain an interesting quotation from Goethe. It was translated, I can't give you the reference, it's one, I think it's from the Maxims and Reflections, or one of those, but it was because Randall Jarrell translated it but doesn't give a reference for it. The translation is, all great excellence in life or art, at its first recognition, brings with it a certain pain arising from the strongly felt inferiority of the spectator. Only at a later period, when we take it into our own culture and appropriate as much of it as our capacities allow, do we learn to love and esteem it. I bring that because there is, and still is today, was from the beginning a certain kind of hostility to modernism, and modernism across the arts. It doesn't exist just in music. It has a particular problem in music. But I mean, one of the problems that one has, of course, if you want to assimilate, as Goethe says, if to assimilate and take the piece into your own culture and appropriate as much of it as your capacities allow, that if it's in music, you have to have a good performance of it. Good performances of really difficult contemporary works are not that often heard. And if you need if a little time to absorb it, you need a couple of performances. You're not going to get most of them. I remember, for example, the problems about contemporary music. I did hear once a piece of Harrison Birtwistle, who was quite a terrific composer in English, and done by Boulez with his chamber orchestra in Paris. And I said to Pierre afterwards that I'd never heard a piece by Harry that sounded that good. He said, we had 35 rehearsals. Is that I also heard Alban Berg's Lulu, the first performances with the third act. When Boulez did it in Paris, I heard the second performance. But then I heard the last performance. There were 13. And at the last performance, was when I said to Boulez that it was as if the orchestra was playing almost by memory. I said, I've never heard that kind of accuracy for a difficult piece like that. He said, we had 45 recording sessions. Well, you think this is unusual. Not actually. It is an economic problem today. But I mean, when they first did Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, In the early 1830s in Paris at the Conservatoire, according to Berlioz, the first rehearsal was so dreadful that they canceled whatever performance they had in mind and rehearsed it every day for a year. When they finally did it, Berlioz, who disliked the conductor, said it was wonderful. He said, I'm sure it probably was very good. But I mean, there is a problem. Is there a wonderful remark of Schoenberg, who once said, my music is not modern, it's just badly played. It's actually, that is a very profound remark, is that the accounts for the kind of hostility. I go back now to autobiography. I'm mostly relatively courteous if I've, on occasions when I've given lectures and got questions from the public, and only once was I actually a bit rude. I had to play Boulez's Third Sonata and some of Elliott Carter, I think the Piano Sonata, in Cincinnati at the conservatory, and there was a question. I gave a lecture afterwards or before, I can't remember which, and there was a question period, and a woman got up and said, Mr. Rosen, don't you think that the composer has a responsibility to write music which is intelligible to the audience? And I remember feeling rather irritated, so I said that I didn't think that question was interesting, but I did think the hostility behind it is interesting, and we will discuss that. And in fact, there is this kind of hostility that exists. I was told at a recent seminar, a meeting about, not so much a seminar, a conference series that Larry Kramer got up and announced that nobody likes Milton Babbitt's music. Since I happen to like quite a bit of Milton Babbitt's music, it means I'm lying. Is that actually, that we've heard that there is this conspiracy theory that keeps coming up. That's where I've sort of written myself out on that. I remember that Peter Gelb, who now head of the Metropolitan Opera, was head of RCA Victor, claimed there was a conspiracy to keep composers who wrote easy music from being heard, as if there was this huge conspiracy to perform all of Schoenberg, Berg, Alban Berg, Pierre Boulez, Luciano Berio. I mean, I don't know where they got that idea. Partly because the predecessor of Peter Gelb at RCA Victor was Goddard Lieberson, who was actually supporting Stravinsky, did all of Stravinsky very remarkably, and made it available. So that in any case is that to understand what happened with modernism, one has to actually go across, not just in music, but in all the arts. But starting with music, I could give one example. There is a nice story of Debussy listening to a symphony by Beethoven, suddenly saying, this is the development section. I can go out and smoke a cigarette. Now, I mean, there is obviously, when you're creating a new style, there is always a certain kind of rivalry, hostility to what has gone before. That's been true all the way through history. But the hostility has never been as great as it was in the history of modernism. I mean, for example, that you have at the end of the 19th century, that book by Max Mordau called Degeneration, accusing all modern artists, poets, musicians, and so on, Richard Strauss, Stéphane Mallarmé, all of being criminal degenerates. It had a marvelous answer written to it by George Bernard Shaw, an answer by a degenerate, he wrote. Nordau said you could tell that Stéphane Mallarmé was a criminal by the shape of his ears. I mean, I don't know whether in the history of art there's ever been this kind of totally wild hostility, and which actually this comes up again today because there was that article that I did write an answer because the cellist Andrew Lloyd Webber's brother Julian Webber wrote an article about how awful modern music is, and they prevented it was a conspiracy to prevent the music of his father from being played. I don't think anybody's actually played his father's music since then anyway, or that anybody wants to. This conspiracy theory is always a dangerous one. I did have a roommate at Princeton and who became a music critic, Michael Steinberg, and he wrote an article in the Times in which he claimed that there was a conspiracy to keep the music of Hans Pfitzner from being played. I remember reading that article and thinking to myself, what a good idea, how can I join this conspiracy? It's there is that I don't feel that I've never been working as an advocate for. I've just played the music that I love. I hasten to say that there's a great deal of modern music, modernist style that I dislike. I might as well open it up. Certainly, the music of Xenakis seems to me utterly without merit. Once in a while, occasionally has sort of a good idea for a piece, and it sort of works in a way. It never makes really good music, but it's interesting for a moment. But most of it is worse than that. So, and there's a great deal that I could discuss about that. There's a great deal of modernist music which is very bad. As there is a great deal of classical music. I mean, during the time of Beethoven, I don't think much of the music of Spohr, for example. It's not too bad. I've never heard a piece that I would consider first rate. There is this interesting controversy, and add a little more autobiography. I did write at one point that difficult music has a greater chance of lasting, of surviving for posterity for some reason, which is quite interesting. And I got an indignant letter from somebody who said, what about Dvorak? He wrote easy music and he survived. That is perfectly true. Dvorak was indeed a fine composer and his music has survived. Basically, about three pieces. There's the cello concerto and the New World Symphony and maybe the G major symphony and the humoresque, which nobody plays anymore anyway. The funny thing about Dvorak, he in a way survives. You don't really hear a lot of him. Whereas a more difficult composer like Brahms or Wagner, you can hear practically almost everything that they wrote. In fact, the greatest piece by Dvorak, I've never actually heard. I've seen the score and admired it, the Variations for Orchestra, a wonderful piece. But I mean, difficult music survives more easily. Bach actually is a more difficult composer than Handel, and actually he survived slightly better than Handel. That is that a good deal of Handel is played, but I mean, much more of Bach actually gets performed of the entire oeuvre. And Mozart was a more difficult composer than Haydn, more difficult for his contemporaries, and he actually survived better in some ways than Haydn. You can hear more Mozart than you can hear Haydn. I do think, I mean, there's a great deal of extremely beautiful Haydn that we all ought to be playing. And so that, yes, I mean, all of this, but there is, so I still stick with that the more difficult composer actually tends to last a little longer and tends to hold a reputation for posterity for some reason. Now, what the characteristic of modernist music is the emancipation of the dissonance, that you do have music up till then is based upon a kind of relation between consonance and dissonance, the ultimate consonance in a tonal piece being the tonic triad. If you have a piece in C major everything is resolved into that tonic triad by the end of the piece. And I mean, there are dissonances and consonances, and expression in tonal music is all based upon that. And to a certain extent, that was abandoned by the beginning of, starts to be abandoned by the beginning of the 20th century. Debussy actually proposed abandoning it, although he never quite abandoned himself, but then it goes on. Now, it does actually, it does happen rather gradually, is that you can trace this emancipation of the dissonance way back in time. You can certainly trace it to the dissonant quartet of Mozart. I went to stagger to the piano. Is that it obeys all the laws of consonance and dissonance. It's not really a piece of modernist music, I used to see, but it was so shocking at the time of Mozart that in the 19th century, for about half century, people kept changing the opening. That they couldn't stand that. That they changed it to that. It's actually very daring, because it's a double dissonance. Is that you have this note and then you play this, which is dissonant to it, but you release this note onto another note which is also dissonant. So that was pretty shocking at the time, but that goes pretty far. In a sense, Mozart's chromaticism is greater than Beethoven's. Beethoven was fairly dissonant in his time too, but this kind of chromatic dissonance is rare. What Beethoven does take from Mozart already is what might be called, or what I've called, chromatic saturation. That's where you play all the notes of the chromatic scale in some way or another, that you have that. There's a famous one in Mozart at the G minor symphony, but I mean, you get it at the beginning of Beethoven 111, where he plays all the diminished chords. You play all that right away, you've got all the notes of the chromatic scale. And gradually this kind of chromatic saturation became widespread in the 19th century with Chopin. A lot of it is Chopin, certainly in Wagner, and finally reaches its peak basically with Schoenberg, with a great example of Erwartung, where at the end of Erwartung, within a period of approximately a second and a half, every single note with the register of the orchestra is played at some point or another. As if it was like huge smear of the thing, as if you have to get all the notes in. It's not just 12 notes of the chromatic scale, but every note within the range of the orchestra. That was a thing. No, you certainly. But there's another way which I don't think has been discussed, that this dissonance was actually developed. One of the things that is clear about tonal music is you define the tonic by the melody, not just harmonically by the chords, but you actually define it by the melody itself. That's the tonic. And what happens that defines the tonic, because all the other notes are appoggiaturas to the tonic. That's the way, it's something that, or the, but it. Now, basically, there are a few examples in Beethoven where he starts outside the tonic, but then he quickly gets there, and he certainly defines the tonic by the horizon, as I said, not just vertically with the harmony, but horizontally with the line of the melody. Eventually, even if he starts outside the tonic, he will always eventually give you most of the time he just plays an arpeggio, as in the Ninth Symphony. However, composers began writing melodies which in fact do not really define the tonic. Let me give one interesting example. Well, I mean that's Brahms' Opus 111. That was supposed to be his last piece. Then he met a clarinetist who was very good, so he wrote out of clarinet pieces, then 45 piano pieces, of which he destroyed half of them. But in any case, that's rather like Stravinsky's fugue. Of course, when Brahms puts the accompaniment to it, it's all tonal. It does actually, when you start writing melodies like that, you have to put an accompaniment under it, although in a sense, it's actually defining eventually, but it's certainly what it is the dissonance content is very great. That's just as great as Mozart's dissonant quartet. And composers start writing melodies which do not really imply the tonic, and as they went on, and not writing simple, really chromatic melodies with diminished seventh chords, but something like Brahms. Or Brahms will write another piece, Opus 119, in which you have actually a series of 11th chords. That is actually tonal, but the dissonance content is very large. Brahms himself, writing to Clara, said, "This is very dissonant, but every dissonance is correctly prepared and resolved." So he was obeying all the rules, but he still liked the dissonant sound, you see. Eventually, the composers decided they needn't obey the rules. If they just like the sound, that's good enough. So, now, in a way, to define modernism across the arts, you need to see not just music, but you have to see the other arts. Was a decision to abandon what might be called any idealization of material, any kind of material which didn't reflect real life, but was very idealized. For example, when you get to the 19th century, and people have portraits, that the avant-garde painters did not paint their portraits in the kind of relaxed, graceful positions that 16th and 17th and 18th century painters did, where you find, for example, people holding their hands gracefully like that. If you want to see today in art somebody holding his hand gracefully like that, you can go to the Russian ballet. They still hold their hands that way. Also ice skaters, because a lot of Russian ice skaters actually were ballet students. If you want to see that kind of idealized form, is that on the contrary, for example, there's those great pictures by Degas of ballet girls. Not one single one that I can remember has a ballet girl in a position which makes her look graceful. That they're all either slumped over like this or trying their shoes. And there was this great exhibition just about 6 months ago at the university, in Boston, at the Museum of Fine Arts, of the nude of nude women by Degas. There wasn't one single woman in a position. that was anything but awkward. He did that quite deliberately. That's actually because he did not want to take something that was considered graceful and make a pretty picture out of it. What he wanted to do was to take something that was considered really quite ugly and make a great picture out of it. The pictures were absolutely fabulous, that there's a kind of, there is a kind of harmony which is absolutely incredible. They were all pictures of, mostly pictures of women getting out of a bathtub and looking very awkward and trying to towel themselves on their backs and things like that. But what happens is that the picture itself does make a beautiful pattern on the paper. Most of them were prints, monotypes and things like that. But also Degas had this incredible ability to indicate by the line just where all of the muscular difficulty of whatever act was in. So there's a kind of harmony between the anatomy of the woman and the actual line of the picture, which is really stunning. If you want another example, you can go and see the famous pictures of the washerwoman who's ironing, and she's holding an iron up like that, and you know just where in her arm this creates a strain by looking at the picture. He had a knowledge of anatomy which translates itself into the line. But this idea of transforming something which is basically awkward and deliberately into something beautiful is absolutely fundamental to modernism, certainly in painting and in literature, is that it begins long before. There's it already back in the early 19th century with Constable. It was a letter of Constable saying, I'm standing in the middle of the most beautiful landscape in the world, therefore the least apt to be put upon a canvas, because what a painter is supposed to do is to make something out of nothing. You do not make something out of nothing by putting the most beautiful landscape in the world on your canvas. What you do is you take something that nobody appreciates and show that you can turn it into a masterpiece. That's what happened, because these people were going out for something. Modernism wasn't a very critical movement. It's basically, instead of trying for traditional beauty, what they wanted was truth to reality. And I can assure you that anybody who's out to tell you the truth is most of the time out to tell you something you do not want to hear. Most of the people who want to tell you the truth are very disagreeable. And there is something actually repellent about almost all the masterpieces of modernism at first sight and first reading. I mean, Madame Bovary, which is the first great example of modern prose of that sort, was actually shipped off to the court and they were declared to be obscene, and finding Flaubert actually won that, but the Flowers of Evil by Baudelaire, actually, he lost the case, and the book was declared obscene. When Ulysses came out, it was banned in this country as obscene, and the judges Random House sued to have Ulysses printed in the United States, and they won the suit. But the judgment of the court was quite interesting. The judge said that the effect of reading the book could be considered emetic, but not pornographic, and he let it in. Yes, I mean that this is this kind of truth. I mean, it starts with, as I said, you have with the Flaubert already, is that the last lines of, for example, of Madame Bovary and the last line of the Sentimental Education are a slap in the face to the entire civilization, the entire culture of France, both of them. That the last line of Madame Bovary is, he's just received the Legion of Honor. That's writing about the pharmacist who is the symbol of mediocrity in that book, as the one who actually in the pharmacist, that's where Madame Bovary buys the arsenic with which she kills herself. But he gets the Legion of Honor. The end of the education of sentimental education is a little even harder to stomach, Henry James, who admired Flaubert, couldn't take that book. How can you write a book about a hero who is so uninteresting? Frédéric goes through the revolution of 1848 in France, and he doesn't understand anything that's going on. He has all these affairs. He has an affair with a poor girl, and he has an affair with the wife of a rich banker. He has an unconsummated, passionate affair with the wife of a publisher. He never understands any of the women, never understands the politics, never understands anything that's going on. And at the end of the book, he's with his friend back in the country, having left Paris, and they're reminiscing about their whole life. And they remember when they were 16, they decided to go to a brothel in the country. And they'd never been before. They picked flowers for the girls. Thought that's what you should do. When they got there, it was a disaster because Frédéric, who was the boy who was rich, had forgotten his money. So they had to go home. And the last line of the book is, that's the best thing that ever happened to us. So I mean that this is one aspect of modernism, is that there always has been. The other thing was that it accepting a kind of difficulty, that what happens is that if what you are doing is taking something which is not considered traditionally beautiful and turning it itself into beautiful, it has to be done entirely by your style, which means that your stylistic shenanigans are very great in modernist effect. That's the reason for the stylistic shenanigans of Joyce's Ulysses, every chapter of which is written in an entirely different style. So it's very hard to figure out the plot as you're reading it, because it keeps changing like that. This bit of difficult, which is very important, and it's quite interesting that to return. I mean, is that I once wrote an article on Mallarmé, which was really about music, because he is considered one of the two greatest poets at the end of the 19th century in France. And his reputation is absolutely stable. Nobody complains. He is a great poet. Nevertheless, most of his poetry is unintelligible to 98% of college graduates in France. This is considered perfectly all right. It's, however, composers who write music which is unintelligible arouse the intense resentment. Well, to go back to what Goethe said, when you find something which is really great and excellent, above all, something which is entirely original and something that's entirely new to you, you feel a sense of pain because you feel inferior. Now, the inferiority is worse for the public of music. If you feel inferior when you see a picture, you go on to the next picture and look at that and see, maybe you catch something. But if you're reading a book, you can put the book down and try something else. But if you're at a concert, you sit there, you're sitting there listening to music that you do not understand, sitting next to somebody who obviously seems to understand it and to love it. And so you feel like an idiot. And you are an idiot in that sense. Because there is the whole question of appreciation of art. There's a certain amount of hypocrisy goes into it. If you read the correspondence of Zelter and Goethe, in 1811, Beethoven is 40 years old. He has a big reputation, but is very contested. And Zelter said, completely exaggerated in one way or another, that he said there are people who think it's absolutely awful, and the others who think they're like fanatics of Greek love. He said, obviously, the taste for Beethoven is something like homosexuality. He said his last piece sounds to me like somebody whose father was a woman or whose mother was a man. Sexual monstrosity. Well, Zelter, by 20 years later, had changed his mind about this. He'd come around to that. It's an interesting change in that correspondence. Now, I mean, as music became, basically it did become more difficult. I mean, Mozart was more difficult than Haydn, Beethoven was more difficult than Mozart, that Wagner was more difficult than Beethoven, Strauss was considerably more difficult than Wagner. There's actually brilliant explanation by George Bernard Shaw about why Strauss is so difficult. Is that what is actually related to this question of dissonance? He said that in ordinary music you have dissonant passing tones. He said in Strauss you can't even talk about those anymore. They're passing phrases. They're whole phrases in Strauss which are dissonant too, and that is perfectly true. There's a very brilliant observation of Bernard Shaw, who knew a lot about music, but he wasn't really professional. I don't know whether in this case it's something he got the idea from one of his professional musicians, or whether he thought it up himself. He was a great music critic. At any rate, is that my favorite line, sentence by a music critic, is by Shaw, saying that after a week of listening to piano recitals, he said, I like to go to the dentist and have my teeth drilled by a steady hand. Is that... I don't want to take, I'm taking for a few more minutes that, what have I left the stuff over there. I do want to talk, just give just a couple of examples of what I've been talking about. Very brief that, I won't take long, because there's further discussion that everybody is planning for questions as well. But I can start by showing you when people wrote sort of music based upon folk music, ethnic music, what they did was they always pick a very pretty tune, Hungarian or Bohemian or something, and arranged it with sort of nice harmonies for the piano, like Liszt's Spanish Rhapsody. And that's basically the way the Hungarian rhapsodies are extremely pretty. And Schubert was the first one to write them, or the Haydn did a little bit. But I mean, and Liszt. But when Debussy came up, Debussy actually changed this in a way which is very radical. Is that De Falla said he taught us how to write Spanish music. And Debussy never went to Spain. He heard some flamenco in Paris, and that inspired him. What he does is he never takes a pretty Spanish theme. He takes fragments of flamenco motives and makes his own piece out of it. That De Falla thought that's the way to write Spanish music. You make something completely original of your own. Not everybody did. Albanians tended to pop to teams to do it. But I mean, it changed. And Debussy was the first where he would take a melody made up entirely of every single note is a single dissonance. Or it's like a second. For example, that is the moon goes down upon the terrace of the past. all those chords you see are dissonant to the agonal chord of the key. Is that there is a big saturation of dissonance in Debussy. One can understand why Rimsky-Korsakov, when teaching the young Stravinsky, who was about to go to Paris, and said, "You better not listen to Debussy, you might end up by liking it." Unfortunately, or fortunately, he did like it. And it was Stravinsky, it was basically Debussy who taught people how to get rid of serial development, as in the style of Beethoven's developments in the symphonies, which everybody used up till then. He got rid of what happened is sequential development, rather. In other words, you can't, Adorno attacked Stravinsky on the grounds that his motives were dead. They didn't create sequences like Schoenberg. Now Schoenberg, when he started writing atonal music, 12-tone music, then he tried to make it, to substitute tonal ideas from it. Let's give you one idea what happened is that that actually it's not strictly tonal, but it's rhythm and phrasing is a tonal cadence, they say. In appoggiatura, that's the way you write tonal music. That's that's why when Boulez took up serial style, he wrote that famous essay called "Schoenberg is Dead," because he wanted to write. Schoenberg basically was writing atonal music, which had all the phrasing and grace of tonal music, and what happened and so on. Now, I can give one further example, which is interesting in some of the finest music of today. Was Elliott Carter. Is that, as we have an anecdote from him on this. He told me when the piano concerto was played in Boston, is that one of the members of the Boston Symphony said to him, "Mr. Carter, the trouble with your music is that if one doesn't play the dynamics you've written, the music doesn't make any sense." Elliott said that, "I thought you were supposed to play the dynamics." Well, and actually that, if you can see that something at the beginning of the beautiful piece he wrote for Petrassi's 90th birthday, there are 90 strong beats. And while that goes on, each one of those is mezzo forte. There are these soft chords, and they're slightly faster than the beats. Actually, the beats occur every, if I count it, should have written this down, if you divide a beat by threes, every 12, 15, every 17 thirds, every 17 triplets, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, bang. However, the soft harmonies change every 15, 16 notes. How do I put this back on? Let me just play the beginning of 90 plus, where you have very beautiful soft changes of harmony against a background of faster, of slightly slower changes of rhythm and then other thing that goes. Now it accelerates. But there's still these other slow beats going in it. So when you get this fascinating layers of different sound, I want to play a beautiful passage from the later in the piece. I should say something about this question of performances. But there's once more the you have this extraordinary expressive line that comes out against these very strict beats, which seem to come from an entirely different rhythmic system. It's very hard to do that. And that there is this problem that about performance, maybe I fill up with another anecdote, then we can go. I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. Well, I don't know. There was an introduction, so I did it. So I just have a minute or so. I'll take another 5 minutes, and we'll go on. Sorry. The question about performance is that I always liked the story of Steuermann, who used to play. It was Schoenberg was a wonderful pianist for a lot of things, including Beethoven. But a man came over to him and said, "Mr. Steuermann, it's impossible to play 12-tone music from memory." And Steuermann said, "But I play 12-tone music from memory." This man was very disconcerted. He said, "You're lying." Well, there is, there's no question about the fact that music has become more difficult to some. I played Carter's Sonata from memory. The first time I played it was in Brussels, and somebody came and said, "The composer has come from Paris just to hear you." And I said, "Oh my God," I said, "I'm going to make something terrible." And I got through it, and then I played it 10 times in Germany, and then Carter asked me if I would play it at a concert at the 92nd Street Y, where there were a number of pieces by other composers being played. It was a quartet by somebody or another. And I went out to play the piano sonata. And the first violinist of the quartet that just played said, "My God, you're not going to play that piece without the music, are you?" I said, "Yes, of course," but then I went, and then I forgot 2 pages of the fugue with the composer sitting there in the music, in the audience. And then since then, I've been unable to play the piece without the music. I have to have the music, except that I keep forgetting to look at it all the time. I have to wonder where I am in it. Is that there's it's not that. It's not that hard to play a lot of music from memory in the end of the. It's easier if you're young. But that I've been unable to. I've never been able to forget a piece that I learned before I was 17. In fact, there are these terrible pieces I have in my memory that I wish to get rid of, and I can't. And to finish with this subject, there is one other difficulty that in order to appreciate new music, you really have to hear it well played a few times or play it yourself and so on. And but there is another difficulty which is can be paralleled, I think, in the other arts. Is that what happens if you look at a painting from the 17th to 18th, 16th, 19th century, you look at it, you know what it's a painting of right away. This is a landscape, this is a jug, this is a still life, and then you admire how it's painted. Well, what happens with a great number of paintings of the Cubist period? You don't know what it's a painting of unless you read the title. And even there's some of Matisse, there's this great, wonderful painting called The Open Window, which would take you a while to decide it's an open window unless you knew that's what it's called, because it's almost as abstract as a Barnett Newman. And, but something similar rather happens with music, that in the case of music, you could generally recognize not so much the sentiment of a piece, was that, but you could, this is a jolly piece, this is a sad piece, and so whatever. And that, although it became harder and harder to put actual names to the kind of emotion you were supposed to feel with music as it went on. But, I mean, the thing is, at least you always knew what kind of a piece it was. You would listen to something and say, this is a fugue, this is a minuet, this is a gavotte, this is a sonata allegro. And you occasionally would be surprised something different would happen, but on the whole, you were generally right. I mean, as you would recognize, this was go to a symphony, this is the opening allegro, and this is in kind of sonata form, and the composers could be a little eccentric about it, but you knew what it was. But in the 19th century, this started to change. There isn't any form that you could give a name to the Chopin ballades. Every once in a while somebody comes up and says, well, it's related to sonata form. Well, it doesn't really work. None of them work as related to sonata form, and they're not actually rondo form either. They're very much free, and when you start getting in some of the pieces like some of the Brahms intermezzi, you don't know what kind of a piece it is until you've been listened to it until the end. Then you know what has happened. And that gets to be more and more the case of music. So it becomes like painting in that sense, that you don't know what it's a painting of until you've either read the title or sort of figured it out. And this is a problem that is, in other words, because composers have actually renounced the basic things that hold pieces together that make music intelligible. They don't want that anymore. Is that one of the things that you can tell, this in the sonata, this is the recapitulation. The main theme is come back. Most avant-garde composers won't do that anymore. I've always liked, Elliot Carter told me the story of Nadia Boulanger talking to Xenakis after a concert, and she said, Xenakis, you don't know how to develop your themes. Xenakis, very surprised, said, what themes? So, I mean, what happens is the perception of music depends on, I said, on different ways of listening, and actually, Randall Jarrell, in this essay that I was talking about, had a marvelous phrase from Wordsworth, where he said that Wordsworth said that every great poet has to create the taste of the audience that he's writing for. And then he added, but the audience cannot be purely passive. The audience has to be actively engaged in understanding. It's not just a passive thing. And that was one of the big problems with music today. To finish, one thing I want to say, I mean, is that I'm perfectly aware that a great deal of modernism is still controversial. But I mean, the achievement of modernism in painting and in music and in prose and in the novel and so on seems to me an obviously permanent one. The question of how is more problem in the music because is that music depends upon getting really good performances. And good performances of the most difficult modern works are actually very rare. And trying to hear them and so get acquainted with them is a kind of makes music more difficult than poetry, painting, or the novel, because it's a question. It's all been printed, so there's no question of survival, but the kind of achievement of the greatest composers from Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Berg, and up to Carter and Boulez today seems to me permanent, and question about how one can actually experience it and come into contact with it. So in any case, thank you very much for being so patient. Oh, thank you. That's a good idea. Thank you.
Turn myself on.
I'm still cold.
How's that? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Terrific. There's so many thoughts in my head now swimming around. I think I'm paralyzed. I have no questions for you.
If I was going to start talking, I should use these hearing aids. It makes music sound terrible. So I don't put them in, but just a second, I certainly put the one on the left to let's to hear you.
Sure.
That's it. Sorry, excuse me. It's oh damn.
You dropped something.
The battery has come out. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, you have to keep it open so the battery dies. Yes, I apologize. I think this will do. I'd like to hear what you're saying.
They'd rather hear what you're saying, I'm sure.
No.
You talked a lot about how the difficult music survives, and you went through the various composers. Well, what do you mean by difficult music? What does that mean exactly?
Well, you know, it's the question about what you mean by understanding. Is that the way you find out whether you understand Beethoven or not is if you like it, you understand it. I mean, if it gives you pleasure, you understand it. That is the only test for understanding in the arts. is that, now obviously there is, in certain cases, a kind of hypocrisy is that you go to a show and with somebody who loves this painting and you pretend that you love it too, and what happens? You eventually get hooked on it. It does start to give you begin. The problem about difficulty is the following. That I think it could be more precise. Just give me less than half a minute. Is that I said the problem was, as I said, that if you hear a piece by Mozart, what happened is that it's not really a problem to appreciate. You do need a certain amount of culture to understand some of the very subtle things that he did, particularly the very elaborate counterpoint that he worked out much more than any other contemporary composer. Nevertheless, it's a language that you're accustomed to, and so on. Now, the problem with music is like the problem with Cubist painting, is that Cubist painting, you don't really know what's going on until you have some idea about the technique of Cubism, and then you understand what the objects are being represented and how they're being represented. That until you actually know, and from experience, with a certain number of composers, the way what is actually being, the way they write their music, instead you're sort of used to the way they write the music, you don't know what the music means, and you don't even know what the form is. It takes a certain amount of listening, you start getting used to it. But I mean, it is a problem, which was that, but this was certainly the case already before. We don't understand quite much of it. I mean, Mozart was considered, it's very hard to believe, Mozart was considered a very difficult composer. Difficult not only to play, but to understand. Is that because they complained about Beethoven, by the way. Of course, Beethoven was very difficult to understand because he was incapable of sticking to the main theme. He kept adding new themes all the time. The fact about it is that nobody ever stuck to the main theme as much as Beethoven. But Mozart, everybody complained that he kept adding new themes all the time. So they knew that Beethoven was hard to listen to, so he must be hard to listen to for the same reason that Mozart was hard to listen to, because he was in the style of Mozart, so they kept repeating the old thing. And I mean, I'm not joking about the hostility. And one of the greatest romantic writers, Tieck, for example, who wrote about music and so on, said that if they considered Mozart mad, then Beethoven is totally insane. I mean, Beethoven was already 45 years old when this was published. So I mean, it's a problem, but it takes a while, and there is a real problem with the economics of music. Might I add one thing? I don't want to keep it.
Please, no.
Well, look, I mean, I was asked by Boulez to record all his music. Right? He asked me to do all the Webern. So I did that, but I asked him to record his music as well. I started with Sonata number 1 and 3. And because I played the third sonata quite a lot, and then I worked on the first sonata, and it came out. It won the Edison Prize, which in Europe is like winning a Grammy. It is the same thing. And it was deleted from the catalog 6 months later. There wasn't any malice in it. It's just that the sale was not very great. But the whole thing was, in a way, a kind of nonsense. That they were committed to recording all of Boulez's music. This was Columbia Records. Now, if you record a piece like Boulez, you can't just expect you're going to get a sale in 6 months, like a sort of pop record, and you either if you're going to compose this thing, you keep it in the catalog for 6 to 10 years, and which is what Goddard Lieberson did with Stravinsky. I mean, basically it was possible to have all of it. But what happens is that this is an economic thing. I mean, since now publishers and record companies are taxed on inventory, which is a completely insane idea. You can't keep books in print, because if you keep the book in print, you have to keep paying for all the stuff in the warehouse. So I mean that until they can you can have immediate braille print by just ordering and have them print a book and have it come next week. Maybe it still hasn't appeared. They've been predicting it for 5 years or 10 years now. But I mean, there was no malice in it. But what happened? Paulini recorded the second sonata, which I was playing, and Boulez transferred to the Deutsche Grammophon. So I never recorded the second sonata because the one thing I didn't want was to have to go to Columbia and protest that they have to put the thing back in the catalog. I don't want dealing with these people. I mean, it's happened to me. Well, I mean, doing that is always, Rubinstein was always, to the end of his life, resentful of the fact that when Horowitz recorded the Tchaikovsky concerto, they took his out of the catalog, and he had to go to RCA Victor and complain and get it put back in. But he never forgave Horowitz or RCA Victor for that. And I don't feel that kind of resentment. I just think it's kind of stupid that if you're going to do contemporary music and you should really have the record available for a number of years until it builds up an interest in that. But that's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to justify economically with, this is a problem.
Let's go back to your Goethe quote about when we encounter excellence, we feel pain and inferiority. I'm wondering, what encounters have you had with excellence that have made you feel inferior or in pain?
Well, as I said, I mean, listening to the Bartok, I knew Bartok's supposed to be great, made me feel sick. So I knew there was something, I decided there was something the matter with me. Well, and I finally came over, and then I played a lot of Bartok, and so I got into it, and then when I heard the Fifth Quartet again, it all came together for me. This is that's happened to me, that I'm extremely fond of the music of Elliott Carter. There's one of the song cycles I didn't like when I first heard it, and I heard it 3 or 4 times. The 4th time I heard it, I thought it was great, but it took me 4 hearings that some things that it is possible, if you're lucky that you like it the first time and you understand it, there's enough of it the first time to come out, but they're repeated hearings will give you more. But very often, if it is really very original and very new and very different from the composer, different from what he's done before, you're likely to be disconcerted. But that happened with, I know Randall Jarrell, who was a great critic of poetry, is that he was very upset by some of the later poems of Wallace Stevens and gave them bad reviews.
Because they were so good.
Sorry later, he didn't quite understand them. It can happen. It made Randall feel inferior in this case. It took a lot to make Randall feel inferior. Yes, he was the most vicious critic I've ever read. I don't know if you read his poetry thing. Well, I love the one on Kenneth Patchen, as Mr. Patchen is very modest about his poems. And when Mr. Patchen is modest, the pigs come in from miles around.
So I have your book here, Music and Sentiment, and I was flipping through it. And you close with this very disconcerting idea here, which is quoting Leopardi, the poet, who says that a beautiful melody badly sung gives little pleasure, and a wretched melody perfectly performed creates great pleasure. So implying really that none of all of this matters, all of this discussion or what the composer does. I mean, if you can give great pleasure with say Ludwig Spohr,
Well, he said that's why music is not really a great art like poetry and painting, but more like cooking and perfumery. There you can see that. In any case, it's a more difficult art. There's no question about. I do add a proviso, which I thought takes that back right after that.
Well, I didn't want to bring that up. That ruins the story.
No, well, I just said that the fact about it is if the music is really great, and if you keep coming back to it, you get more out of it each time, which is not the case with a wretched melody, even well sung. I mean, No, I've heard, in any cases, that I've heard really terrible pieces magnificently played, and it doesn't really give me that much pleasure in the end. But then I'm professional, and Leopardi was not a professional musician.
I guess they're empty calories.
Right about the general public.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that a beautiful voice to them is more important than a really beautiful melody. Yes.
Do you want to take some questions from the audience?
Yes, that's
okay. So maybe if you could raise your hand and.
I thought I was going to get attacked more by you.
Oh. No, I have a whole army of people ready to attack you.
Right.
If we could just keep the questions very brief and in the form of a question, and then I'll rephrase them so that, in case somebody can't hear them. Are there mics? Yes. Oh, yes, there are microphones. So if you could approach the mic.
I have a very brief question for each of you. For Mr. Wakin, why doesn't the Times support contemporary music more? And before you get to that, for Mr. Rosen, what about Dvorak's chamber music? You mentioned only 3 great pieces of his, but it seems to me he has a lot of good chamber music too.
So the first question was for me, which is why doesn't the Times support contemporary music more? And the question for you was, what about Dvorak's chamber music, which is great. So I'll answer my part first, which is, I don't speak for the entire New York Times. I can say, though, I think in general that it's not a newspaper's job to support one thing or another. We cover the news, at least that's what I do, and then the critics will, in their way, cover the music scene. So maybe the question is, why don't we have more reviews about contemporary music? I would take issue with that. I think we have lots of reviews about contemporary music. We also have a very limited amount of space and an unbelievable mountain of things going on in New York every week. So we do the best we can, picking and choosing. And the other thing is, we also have to look at the music that draws a large audience and that has lots of money devoted to it, at least from my perspective as covering the news. We have to cover the Metropolitan Opera, have to cover the New York Philharmonic. You can't avoid the big dinosaurs out there that a lot of people attend and want to know about. So the question for you was Dvorak's chamber music.
Well, there are beautiful pieces, but which I know, they don't seem to me. I've got. There are the Dumki Trio and so on, but they just seem to me that they're quite at the level of the greatest works of Brahms, Schubert. They're not quite that good. The variations for orchestra are really a stunning piece. I think, the chamber music that I've heard at Dvorak, I've liked quite a lot of it and said it is said fine, but it's never seemed to me the kind of masterpiece. Like the other symphonies, beyond the New World Symphony and the G major, I don't really think the other symphonies amount to that too much. But I mean, he was quite a good composer. But I mean that this is debating somebody's taste. Is that there's a great deal of good music. But the problem is that, and I mean, if I love it, then I pretend, then fine. But there is a lot of music that I've never wanted to love. I never wanted to love Scriabin, for example. So I really don't care how people play Scriabin. It's perfectly all right with me.
Is there another Russian composer that you'd like to talk about your feelings of? Another Russian composer, I think you had mentioned to me a while ago, you have a certain viewpoint.
Oh, you want me to say? Well, as far as I'm concerned, Shostakovich, it's Mahler with wrong notes. That's to make it sound modern. I mean, the problem that I do think there is a problem of today, which there has been in a number of periods of what might be called coherence of the I mean, if you write, most people who write, for example, tonal music today That has nothing to do with what Mozart thought tonal music was. In Mozart, every note in a piece is related to the tonic. Is that the whole system in Mozart is that one says that every time there's a modulation, it becomes more distant from the center or nearest the center, so it's very complex and very subtle. A lot of this disappears in the 19th century. One thing disappears in the 19th century. It was very important to Mozart and even still to Beethoven whether when you went modulation, if you went in the flat direction or the sharp direction. In other words, did you go from C major to F major and B flat, or did you go from C major to D major, G major and D major? This was entirely different. They had different functions in the music. It doesn't in Schumann anymore, because the music has become so chromatic that there's no difference, really. That it's partly what might we call that equal temperament. If you tune everything the way it tunes on the piano, then there isn't much difference from going from F sharp to G, from C major to F sharp or C major to G flat. It's the same thing. For Mozart, it was different. It still was different, although they were beginning to use equal temperament on his pianos too. So the rot set in at that point. And what happens, a different kind of music, but there was a different kind of complexity in the 19th century of heavily charged chromaticism, which with Chopin and above all Chopin and Wagner, and that was wonderfully used. But today, composer who writes tonal music, they just use triads as far as I can see. And I like triads too, but a lot of triads with nothing, no spice to it, I prefer a little more, something more, a little different. And this question about a taste for difficulty is that this happened certainly in poetry. If you read what happened with Mallarmé, is that there are people who started reading Mallarmé and they couldn't read easy poetry anymore. Where you hadn't, when the first time you read the poem, you had no idea what it was about. It took 10 readings to figure out it. Victorieusement fui le suicide volontaire, victoriously fled the voluntary suicide. It takes a lot of reading to figure out that poem is about a sunset. It's the sunset, the sun commits suicide every time it disappears. That's what happens.
Well, speaking of sunsets, I think the sun is getting close to going down on this event. But so I think we'll take one more question, and I think the lucky gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you. Just a question about literary criticism.
I can't hear it.
Question about literary criticism.
And you once made a comment that you wish you had encountered Walter Benjamin's writings before you wrote classical style.
You once said that you wished you had read Walter Benjamin before writing your book, Classical Style.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about his influence on you. And
well, there were things that I would do differently. Is that I think that on the whole, where he believes that the style should be described as a synthesis of all possible extremes, including virtual extremes. So I would have paid more attention to certain aspects of the classical style but frankly nowadays, I can't remember what I would change now, right? I mean that I did in a sense write a new chapter to it where I tried to discuss the fact that, for example, that of the Beethoven breaking every possible convention, and at the same time that he breaks the convention, he always figures out a way to bring back the convention somehow. In a way, I learned more about Mozart from that, but that is perfectly. Mozart writes. Every time Mozart does something extremely unconventional, he immediately follows it by the most conventional possible thing you could do to make it up for it. So I think that the Benjamin would have helped me in that one sense, yes.
Okay, great. I think that's good. Thank you so much.